right, let's kick off. Welcome to this afternoon's panel, Yiddish in Performance. It promises to be a very generative discussion between these three people to my left. I'll just start by saying that Melbourne Jewish Book Week acknowledges the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nation as traditional owners and custodians, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And we also acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of lands across Australia and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. I'll just note as well, this session is sponsored by the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization, or ACJC, at Monash University. So to my left, we have, on the far left, Simon Starr, who is a Melbourne musician who's very passionate about Jewish music. Informed me not to give too much of an intro, but many of you may know him. And he also created the 22-piece Yiddish supergroup Yid, and enjoys exploring all modes of Jewish music making. Good applause. To the right there, Galit Klas, an award-winning writer, director and performer and arts visionary who pushes the boundaries of bilingual theatre and music. Her most recent works are Yentl, the Ghetto Cabaret, the Yiddish techno group Der Glos, and the family comedy The Cantor. And then to my direct left, we have Professor Rebecca or Rivka Margolis, the Director and Pratt Foundation Chair of the ACJC at Monash. She's a scholar of migration and cultural history with a focus on the transmission and revitalisation of Yiddish. Her current research focuses on new Yiddish cinema. And I'm Nicola Mensa Hearn. I'm a PhD candidate at the ACJC, currently doing a PhD project about queer Yiddishkeit in Australia, and looking at sort of transnational Yiddish performance, and very excited to be here today. So we want to kick off maybe by setting the scene a little. I'll go to Rivka to provide us with a bit of a brief history and overview of Yiddish performance, including in an Australian context.
Shalom Aleichem. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here. And I have to say that this panel, I think, is going to be the best thing that I've done since I got here in terms of sort of outward-facing events, because I'm here with three of my favorite people in the city who are all deeply invested in Yiddish in really exciting ways. So I'm really looking forward to a fruitful conversation, and I also look forward to hearing your questions and comments afterwards, because this is an area that I'm deeply invested in as a scholar and also just as a person. I'm a Yiddishist. I think Yiddish performance is really one of the areas where Yiddish is blossoming moving forward, and I'm deeply excited to be in this city in the middle of all of this Yiddish activity. So my role here is to give this academic, scholarly context for what Galit and Simon are going to share with you about their own work right now. And I'm doing this partly as an outsider. So you can hear I'm not from here, I'm a Canadian. Canada also has a very rich history of Yiddish, also has a very rich post-Holocaust cultural context for Yiddish. But in a sense, Melbourne to me is really the place to be in the world right now when it comes to Yiddish performance and Yiddish activity more broadly. There is so much innovation happening here, and part of it is individuals. So obviously, without Simon, there would probably be no Yid. Without Galit, there wouldn't be Docha Modnem Glos. But there's also sort of a larger context of the city being a space where Yiddish is continues to be a living language. And I think that context is very important. So what I'm going to do now is just basically sketch out what the scholarship says about what Yiddish has become in the post-Holocaust period, and then situate Melbourne within that context. The biggest theorist of Yiddish after the Holocaust is Jeffrey Chandler, and he came up with a theory called post-vernacular Yiddish that he elucidated in several articles and in a book, where he basically framed all Yiddish after the Holocaust as something that has become symbolic. Nobody needs to speak Yiddish after the Holocaust. Everybody speaks other languages. Yiddish is multilingual, as it always has been, and all Yiddish speakers are choosing to continue to engage with the language. So that is the basis for post-vernacular Yiddish. Vernacular Yiddish is Yiddish that is a language that is spoken in a communicative way without any sort of self-consciousness. So somebody who's raised as a native Yiddish speaker in 1850 in a shtetl in Poland is a vernacular Yiddish speaker. They're not making linguistic choices. They're not thinking, well, what does it mean when I speak Yiddish? And how does this position me in my identity? They are simply functioning in the language in many cases because they have no alternative. They are not invited into the wider non-Jewish dominant society to use the languages of that world. Post-vernacular Yiddish assumes that Jews who speak Yiddish are now dispersed, and they are joined by non-Jews who are also interested in the language because the language represents different aspects of identity or culture or creativity or some other chosen form of engagement. So Yiddish can represent, for example, the non-hegemonic language that it has been historically. Yiddish is a language that has never held power, that has never really been rooted in any kind of state that supported it, except briefly in the Soviet Union. And so Yiddish represents the underdog, the non-hegemonic identity. It also has a very strong leftist orientation historically. It has an orientation towards making the world a better place, and also a very, very strong and vibrant history of cultural production, which is what Galit and Simon are going to speak to today. So all of those things combined make Yiddish a very, very appealing place for people to choose to position themselves, even if they have access to multiple other languages. So the example for post-vernacular Yiddish that is often used is the performance space. Jeffrey Chandler goes as far as to say that all Yiddish use after the Holocaust, so over the past 70 years, has been inherently performative. There's an aspect of us performing or acting out or voluntarily engaging with Yiddish in a way that we are self-consciously aware of. So the question that is interesting for me in Melbourne is that there is this transition from vernacular to post-vernacular that I think in some sense is not complete here. It's still happening in ways that I think are very, very interesting. There's a very large population of native Yiddish speakers who continue to engage with the language, but there has been a transition because their parents' generation, who are the Holocaust surviving native speakers for whom Yiddish was the vernacular, are passing on. So what does it mean for the generation who was raised as English speaking in Melbourne, but who are also in some cases native Yiddish speakers, fluent Yiddish speakers? What does it mean for them to continue to engage with Yiddish if they're no longer using it with their parents or grandparents, but continue to consider it to be an important part of their lives? So what does one do with that connection with Yiddish? What does it mean when somebody who is engaged with Yiddish goes to see a performance and goes to hear Yiddish, goes to a conversation class, sings in a Yiddish choir, thinks in Yiddish, writes poetry in Yiddish? I've had some very interesting conversations with people who are involved with Yiddish in this city. And interestingly, to me, is that there isn't that post-vernacular approach to the language that I find when I speak to performers or cultural practitioners in places like New York or Tel Aviv or Montreal. In those places, I found people say very distinctly when I ask, why are you singing in Yiddish? Why are you creating Yiddish plays? Why are you doing this activity when you're not a native Yiddish speaker? In some cases, you've learned Yiddish. You're choosing Yiddish. Why are you choosing Yiddish? And they say, Yiddish is a symbol for something. It's a symbol of my identity. It's a symbol for my queerness, for my leftist identity. It's a symbol of my politics. It's a symbol for something. And there's a self-conscious thought process that's gone into that. When I have these conversations in Melbourne, I get more of a surprise. When people say, what do you mean? What does it mean? Of course, why wouldn't I be using Yiddish? Of course I'm using Yiddish. Yiddish is my heritage language. It evokes my family connection. It evokes our past. It evokes what we experienced in the Holocaust and the losses of our communities in the Holocaust. But I have found there's been a much more sort of natural and fluid engagement with Yiddish that hasn't necessarily been framed by the sense that there has to be an identity politics around the language. So there's no doubt that Yiddish in 2022 worldwide has moved into a space where it is a chosen language and chosen identity. And by the way, Chandler goes as far as to say that even Hasidim are post-vernacular speakers of Yiddish, because all of them live in societies that would easily allow them to become speakers of dominant languages. There's no barrier stopping a Haredi person from speaking English in Brooklyn or speaking Hebrew in Jerusalem. There's no barrier there except the barriers that those communities themselves choose to impose on their language. So it's a debatable point, but still interesting. So where we stand now in terms of Yiddish performance is that performing in Yiddish is, I'm sure Simon and Galit will agree, a time-consuming process, requires a lot of resources, in many cases translation, particularly when the artists involved aren't themselves necessarily fluent Yiddish speakers. So I'll speak for Galit here, who I know learned Yiddish at Monash, which I'm very proud of. And that process is a time-consuming and dedicated process of reclaiming language or acquiring new language. And like most secular Yiddish speakers, really under the age of 40 today, we're looking at a community of new learners, people who have studied Yiddish and have become speakers of the language or readers of the language, performers of the language through a process of very, very labor-intensive work. And to me, that journey is very, very significant. I'll say similar things about Simon, who deliberately opted for Yiddish as the language of his musical project, in some sense because there were musicians I know that you really respected who sang in Yiddish. So Husky Gowenda, for example, is a Yiddish singer. But I think there's a process there that is significant too, of returning to Yiddish, of identifying Yiddish as a performative space that is significant. And one of the things that I think I'm going to leave you with, a thought I'm going to leave you with about Yiddish, is that in a sense, this is a space that everybody abandoned. And that's why it's such a fruitful performative space. And when I say abandoned, I mean that the Jewish communities who brought Yiddish with them to new places after the Holocaust didn't continue to speak the language day to day and transmit it to their own children in a majority kind of way within their communities. So yes, there are dedicated families that have transmitted Yiddish, and there's the Sholem Aleichem College and the Kadima and a framework for transmitted Yiddish. But most of the Jews of this city, as of the world, are not regular Yiddish speakers. So in a sense, there's this space that nobody owns, nobody controls, and therefore that's a very, very fruitful environment in which to produce new artistic projects. And there's really no one to say you can't do it that way, which I think is a change that's really happened over the last decade or two, where Yiddish is really an open space to create the projects you want to create, to go back to original texts, to set them to music, to create theatrical works out of them, and to perform Yiddish on stage so that it's heard in a very, very living and active way. And that can mean any number of things to the performers, to the creators, and to audiences. Thank you very much.
Dank, Rivka. What an excellent setting of the scene. I think let's go to the two practitioners now. So in that context, Simon and Galit, I'd love for you to introduce your work and just speak a bit to how your work engages with Yiddish. Rivka mentioned it, but if you could go into a little more detail and specifically why, for each of you, Yiddish is part of your work, is a language, Yiddish language and Yiddish culture, sort of cultural ways of enacting culture are part of your work. So whoever would like to take that one first can take us away. Galit?
I guess I first started putting Yiddish into my work when I was trying to tell a story that could only be told through Yiddish, because it was a personal story. It was a short cabaret that I wrote about my grandmother, my relationship with her, and me trying to understand the kind of what I thought was a very difficult person. And so I had to tell some of that story in Yiddish because Yiddish was such a big part of her life. And so I sang part of it in Yiddish. And then after that, I sort of became that almost like a bit of an ambassador. This was before I had anything to do with the Kadima, in the pre-Kadima days. And people heard it and started to ask me, started to come to me with stories about their heritage and their Jewish heritage. And through that, I just started creating more Yiddish work. I just thought it was such an important thing to do. That's a beginning. Yeah.
Thanks.
So I was living in Israel for 6.5 years with my family and my wife and children. And when we came back to Australia, it was really important to me to carry the feeling that I had when I lived in Israel. And that feeling was very palpably innovative and dynamic. That's how I find Israeli society in general, and in particular the music scene. Now, I grew up feeling like Israel was my home. I didn't grow up in a very Yiddishist household, even though my grandfather was a Yiddish teacher. And so in some ways, Yiddish for me is the feeling of going over to my grandparents' place and meeting their friends who were all called Anka and Batya and Gutya, and them talking in Yiddish and pinching my cheeks and that sort of thing. So it's a very warm, nostalgic feeling. But I wanted to couple that with the sense of being plugged into the main switch, which is what I got from living in Israel. And so I didn't really come from a deep Yiddish context. That combination turned out to be what Yid became. And I mean, there's a lot of serendipity about how that band came about. I won't bore you with the details, but I met Husky probably 25 years ago, and I loved his voice then. He was still a teenager and he was singing, just starting a bit of singing. And then one of my bands, we did a residency with with his first incarnation of his band, which was called Husky. And I just loved, there's something so soulful about him. And when I came back to Australia, he started a band, the Beshava Singers, which was the project, which was kind of a folk Crosby, Stills and Nash style reimagining of some Yiddish songs. And so I just felt like it was really important to have him and Gideon in this project, whatever it was, which somehow changed into this big blustery sort of Yiddish big band. And just talking about what Rivka spoke about before, how there are no rules. My experience was we performed in Toronto in 2018, and then a lot of us went on to New York after that, where at the time Fiddler on the Roof was performing its sort of record-breaking run in Yiddish in New York. And a lot of people in Canada came up to us and they were saying things like, no one ever plays these songs anymore, and no one ever plays these songs like this anymore. So I feel that in some ways there is a Yiddish sort of playbook, and that Yiddish playbook is very American-centric, or sort of North America and Canada-centric. I don't know about Canada, where it's become a little bit of a museum piece to some degree. The klezmer performance is very... there's just a way to do it, and the most radical that people get is by maybe playing with some electric instruments. And they found something very alive in what we did, which was completely unknowing on our part, and just fortunate, I suppose. But the whole point was to approach this music or this culture in the same way that it was created. And the way that Yiddish culture was created, you know, when I look at we were talking in the dressing room before, I was talking with Galit about Itzik Munger's Megillah, and Yiddish poetry from the 1900s, Yiddish literature. It is so, it has that same feeling that Israel has for me, of people who refuse to be locked into a definition, people who refuse to be playing by the rules, or even recognizing the rules, and just completely telling things how they are in a very colourful, vibrant, alive, often vulgar sort of way. And that vulgarity, and that, which I don't find vulgar, I just use that word as it's a symbol, but for me that vulgarity is actually humanity and warmth. And when combined with the feeling of Israel, I feel that is actually closer to, for me, as an outsider, what the true essence of Yiddish is, which is this language that is very much constantly evolving. And as you said, the vernacular is constantly evolving, much like Hebrew. And so for me, I want to create work that always feels surprising, but not surprising for the sake of surprising people, but surprising because we went on a bit of a journey and we took some chances, and we maybe combined some things that haven't been combined previously in Yiddish work, and then to shove them all together, not to necessarily all place them together nice and tidily, but to shove some of them, to organize others, so that the end result is a full spectrum of humanity, which is not always pretty and not always beautiful, but is always true. And that's what I'm aiming for. And I feel that Yiddish literature and Yiddish poetry is so dedicated to that pursuit of truth, which I find really exciting.
That's great, Simon. Thank you. That actually leads really neatly into something I wanted to ask both of you, which is how do you understand your practice sort of in place in Australia in terms of linking into this Yiddish lineage, this sort of historic and global Yiddish lineage, but today, at the moment in Australia, what does Yiddish mean as performance, do you think?
Okay, so again, I'm only going to speak, I can't speak from within the Yiddishist world. I'll speak as a musician and as a fervent Zionist. I teach at Monash University in the jazz course and in the popular music course, and most students' default position would be anti-Israel. And I've had some fairly robust discussions with students and with other staff, and they would have a lot of problems with Israeli bands or Israeli music, and whenever I unashamedly tell them that I lived in Israel and play Israeli music and blah, 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 they, there's that sort of, for them, I suppose it's an awkward silence. For me, I'm fine with it. But when I talk about Yiddish, there's that extra 5% of acceptance because they don't really understand it. They don't know where it comes from. They may have watched Seinfeld. They may say the word schmuck. I don't know, but that's about it. And so it's kind of cute and warm and fuzzy because it belongs to the American comedy world. And so it's less threatening, which is why I think so. Yiddish performed at WOMAD, which is a big world music festival in Adelaide. We've performed there twice, and have only been sort of welcomed with open arms. And I've suggested to the artistic director a number of times to bring Israeli acts or to bring, things that are performed in Hebrew, and she's not so keen on that. WOMAD, for instance, is supposedly apolitical, but the only political representation there is a Free Palestine stand there, and so I just kind of get the feeling that Hebrew is a bit persona non grata or lingua non grata, but the Yiddish is kind of they're the sort of the good Jews. Maybe it's because there's that book. I don't remember the title. People only like dead Jews or something like that. Has anyone read that? What's that? What's it called? Everyone loves dead Jews. So I think that in Australian sort of the Australian pseudo-intellectual circles of say university, both students and teachers, the Yiddish represents the good dead Jews because it's from the Shoah, and so I feel like if I'm going to play something in Yiddish, I'm not going to dress it up nicely. My character is naturally combative and sort of confrontational, and so that's why Yid has an exclamation mark after it, and it's why, for instance, in America, we were offered a tour and an agent to represent us when we visited there after Canada. But he said, "You're going to have to change the name because it's a bit pejorative." And I said, "But what about NWA, which is a famous rap group called Niggers with Attitude, or what about Wogs Out of Work?" And I was talking about all these ethnic minorities that have reclaimed their sort of supposedly derogatory names, and he was totally against it. And he said, "Why don't you call it the Simon Starr All Stars, and maybe no electronic beats, and maybe play some songs people know." Anyway, so my feeling is that I don't want to be one of the dead good Jews. I want to be just a Jew with an exclamation mark afterwards, and Yiddish is just a big part of that. Yiddish has to be as big a part of that as Hebrew or Ladino or Arabic or whatever language we're going to perform in, but it has to be. It's part of my sort of tribal representation.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. All right. If Yiddish is representing the good dead Jews, Galit, we spoke. Oh, do you want to?
No, you go. Yeah.
We spoke briefly yesterday about your sort of part of your practice being as well, maybe moving towards like positive Yiddish, positive representations of Yiddish. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I agree that Yiddish represents the good dead Jews. For me, Yiddish represents, like, I guess, Like for me, I want Yiddish to be more than just about the Holocaust moving forward and about a really positive expression of Jewish culture and pride. And I feel like that's happening in a way in Melbourne as we're creating new Jewish performance and Yiddish performance. So I feel like, and I hope that we get away from that. Yiddish is the dead Jews and Hebrew is the live Jews. And I know and we both actually perform in Yiddish and Hebrew a lot. I'll often do shows with Yiddish and Hebrew together.
Can I just clarify something quickly?
Yeah.
When I say good dead Jews, I don't mean that's how I see it.
Sure,
I think that's how the non-Jewish public can frame it in terms of the Australian arts community.
Yeah.
I'm totally with you in terms of
Yeah.
Yiddish being it is just the language that this great art happens to be performed in.
Yeah, exactly.
Pray continue.
Exactly. No, I know people do feel like Yiddish is a kind of secret world, and everyone got very excited about unorthodox because it opened the door to this hidden world that we hadn't seen before, and Yiddish does do that for people. So what was your question?
On that note, I think when Simon said, good dead Jews and Yiddish, I thought...
Oh, positive stuff.
Positive Yiddish. What does that mean?
Well, this came from my partner who said, Galit, everything you do in Yiddish is about oppression and pain and suffering and trauma, and why can't you just do a love story that happens to be in Yiddish? And he's French, so he's just a nice play that happens to be in Yiddish. And I was like, I guess there's certain... sometimes when I'm picking material to use on stage, I'm like, does it have a Yiddish charm? You sort of just run it through your own kind of mental process. Would this work well in Yiddish? And so many, I guess, things that are related to pain, loss, grief, they do work well in Yiddish. But I did take that as a challenge. So I do hope to create something that happens to be in Yiddish, but is not necessarily about having to survive persecution. So I hope to create something like that in the future. For now, it's still using the material that I love, like the poetry and the literature, and trying to present it, like Simon, in a more contemporary way. So, for example, putting it with electronic music or techno, trying to create some Yiddish dance music, things like that.
That's great, thanks. At this point, I'll let the audience know that there will be a Q&A at the end of this session in the last 10 minutes or so. So start thinking about your questions now. I'm sure you'll have some. Okay, I just want to speak briefly. We've talked about Yiddish in Australia, but you've both, particularly Simon, mentioned Israel, mentioned sort of how Yiddish is sort of seen in North America as well. How do you think Australian Yiddish performance community, is there a conversation happening between what's happening in Australia and these other places, would you say?
My experience was that our isolation was a real bonus. Our isolation has led us to, even though obviously we're all connected, a global village, all that sort of thing, but geographically the Yiddish performance in Melbourne happens in Melbourne, and its isolation from North America, for instance, is a real... it's a good thing. It means that we're not part of the politics that exist there, particularly in the music world, about how to do things and all that sort of thing. So, which was why when we got there, it seemed like a breath of fresh air. I mean, so in terms of conversation, there are people who are interested in, for instance, Yid and, for instance, the Besheva singers, but they're also interested in, a magazine like Forward, they are interested in anyone doing anything in Yiddish. And the bar is not necessarily that high, I would say. So the conversation is pretty much just a welcoming to anyone who will perform in Yiddish and record it and publish it and do it. And I sort of, again, I don't want to, I feel like the conversation is that we are a little bit isolated in Australia to our advantage, and we're applying sort of what seems like globally innocent in a global context. There's sort of these innocent standards and attempts to merge it with other influences and other cultures. And I actually feel like the conversation is very much two-way, and that people have been, as Rivka said before, have been looking to Melbourne for what's happening, because they I feel like they just got caught in a bit of a bubble in America. Less so in Israel. In Israel, it's a bit fetishistic. I find it. It's sort of these two female singers did a sort of a gangster version of Chiri Bim, which got a lot of airtime in Israel, but it was not necessarily. I don't know. I won't comment on the standard of it. It was pretty good, but it wasn't exactly breaking new ground. It was a little bit fetishistic. Sort of, what would happen if we sang it exactly normally, but we dressed up as gangsters?
I think there's something amazing about Melbourne is that we've really encouraged the younger generation to perform. And I mean, that came from the Monash Uni days of like offering scholarships for Yiddish students and the Kadima supporting Yiddish artists. And so we have been able to create this new work. And I have been in discussion with the two theatre companies, the Yiddish theatre companies in New York, but we're almost on different pages in a way. We're doing totally different things, and that's kind of similar with the one in Paris, where we're creating sort of more original work compared to what is going on in New York. And I agree. I think like our isolation in a way from the rest of the world has sort of kept up this authenticity and just that we also have this intergenerational contribution to performance here, which I'm not sure that I see overseas.
I think it has to do with that vernacular, the vernacular use of Yiddish that Rivka was talking about before, because it is less. It seems that that what we produce is less generated from the idea of Yiddish, and as you were saying, it's just from living the Yiddish thing. And so, even though that wasn't my personal background, I found so much encouragement and enthusiasm from everyone in the community, in the Yiddish community, who are just, and some of whom, if not most of whom, the older ones, who you would think, oh, we better tone it down. This is a bit, they might get a bit upset by this. To the contrary, I find the older ones are the ones who are sort of kicking up their heels, and they're the ones most likely to set fire to the town hall. They're the most radical ones, because that's what Yiddish feels like to me. Is this explosion of spirit, and so I think we have that more here. And in New York, it feels like it's tied up with the religious world, and if it's not the religious world, then it's tied up with the post-vernacular idea of Yiddish, which, yes.
So I just want to comment on this, I think, very interesting point of discussion. Melbourne really is different from other Yiddish centers. I'm saying this from a scholarly perspective, having researched different places where Yiddish happens. And I think the main feature of that is the intergenerationality. So when there was a performance last year of Yid and Duchamod Nemgloz, and there were 4 generations there, smashed in together and dancing. And these are 4 generations of people who are connected to Yiddish in some way. And sometimes 4 generations who can actually speak Yiddish, which I think is a remarkable and unique thing. Melbourne is really the only place left in the world where Yiddish is being taught to children under the age of 12 in a secular context. There's nowhere else in the world where that's happening anymore. I'd like to say it was still happening in Montreal. It's not. That's been phased out. So there's this intergenerationality, and the transmission is happening sort of in a natural sort of way that historically languages have been transmitted. What's happening in other centers where secular Yiddish culture is really active is that Yiddish is being transmitted not within generations of families, but there's a rupture that happens. So there's a process where somebody's family, if they're of Jewish heritage, stopped speaking Yiddish 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, and then the children of today return. And there's been a complete break. And so they're returning and starting with an emotional connection, but no linguistic heritage at all. They're going to university, or they're going to music festivals, intensive language festivals, in order to learn Yiddish and really starting over. And this is this generation of new learners who are involved in a kind of transmission of Yiddish that is one of the determinant features of the language today, which is that mostly secular Yiddish is not being transmitted among generations anymore. It's being transmitted within a cohort. It's being transmitted by people who are very close in age and not biologically related. And this is a fascinating feature of Yiddish. And it also ties into Nicola's area of interest, which is queer Yiddishkeit. There's a very, very queer way that Yiddish is being transmitted, because it's being transmitted not biologically, but within groups of people, among groups of people who share an interest in the language. But what that means is that you don't get that intergenerationality that we find here in Melbourne, and that sense of connection to Yiddish that exists within families and within personal heritage without that rupture. And I think that is, in fact, very much a feature of Yiddish here. And the bubble that Simon described in America is a bubble that has resulted partly from the fact that everybody's being trained in the same Yiddish spaces. Everybody's going to the same klezmer festivals, the same language courses with the same teachers and the same books and the same materials. It's great that all of these places exist, but it does mean that there's a lot of normativity in how Yiddish is being transmitted, versus a place where Yiddish is being transmitted within families with the original dialects of the places where people come from. So one thing you'll hear in Melbourne is people speaking with a Polish dialect. That is very unusual in the rest of the world when you move into the third or fourth generation removed from that post-Holocaust generation. So there is something very, very particular about Yiddish in Melbourne, and I think there is that sense of geographic isolation that's fostered that, but also the intergenerational transmission that exists here.
That's such a good point, Rivka. And on a very small tangent, I just mentioned that I'm also a newcomer to Melbourne. I grew up in Canberra, and I'm one of the, I count myself as not a Melbourne Jew, but a Jew who grew up with that sort of, disjuncture from the language. And I'm coming to it now where, my grandfather would have spoken a little, but not really since my great-grandparents. So that does exist in Australia, but certainly not in the same way as North America, and really places Melbourne in this very unique space, I think. There's something really special about the Yiddish community in Melbourne, which I've certainly found since moving here. Really briefly, before we go to Q&A, when we were talking about transmission of sort of language in Melbourne and between Melbourne and other parts of the world, and you mentioned, Simon, being sort of isolated, that made me think, well, how did COVID isolations and COVID lockdown perhaps affect your practice in terms of Yiddish? Because I know for myself and for a lot of queer Yiddish spaces, there was a huge blossoming of culture created in online spaces. Was it similar for theatre and music? Obviously.
When was COVID? I don't remember.
COVID, schmovid.
Yeah.
Not COVID, schmovid.
We did a bit more sort of international panels. We had an international panel. So we did connect a little bit more to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and talk about Yiddish and Yiddish performance.
But perhaps not a huge impact on your own practice at home.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah,
no.
that's interesting. That's great.
It didn't have, COVID didn't have much of an impact on me. It did have an obvious social impact, mainly through my children being at school, at home. But in terms of music and thinking and all that, so I did a lot of thinking. I did a lot of composing and a lot of practicing, which I would probably do anyway. It was focused on Yiddish to some extent because the Yid album, the second Yid album, had been planned to be recorded, and then it didn't get because of lockdown, and then we got in April 2021 to record, and then we went into lockdown again, so I couldn't meet up with Josh Abrahams to mix. So we were talking a lot about it, and then I could only go over to his place with a mask and a certain amount of vax requirement. Anyway, so it had an effect on us, but it was a sort of, it has made it in many ways just all the more sweeter because it just provided some breathing space between the generation of the artwork and then the sort of refinement of it through mixing and mastering and finishing it off. So it's been, I think it's allowed it to settle in a way that, and this Yid album is going to be out very soon, and I hope you all hear it because I think it's great. I hope you don't hear it because I think it's great. I hope you listen to it because you think it's great. But the isolation made it sound, it's sounding in a certain way that it wouldn't have sounded if we'd have just recorded it and mixed it straight away. So a little bit of space was a good thing for me in terms of, and letting the sort of, in the meantime I read the book Born to Kvetch, which was most instructive and gave us a few ideas for raps.
Yeah, I guess that happened with us too, where we actually no, it didn't. Oh no, it did. It did. We ended up with more rehearsal time for Yentl which was great because we needed it. The actors especially needed more time than we'd originally given them to be able to learn the Yiddish.
That leads me very neatly onto the last question I wanted to put to you before we go to Q&A, which is, what do you find the challenges, maybe even the rewarding challenges, but the challenges of working in Yiddish in performance?
Okay, so for me it's that Zionist Hebrew-centric milieu that I grew up in, look at Yiddish as a sort of a, you know, something that their grandparents might have listened to. They associate it with, I don't know, Fiddler on the Roof or old klezmer or something like that, and they don't see it as a living, breathing thing. So getting people excited and interested in Yiddish music these days carries a little bit of that stigma, partly which I think, you know, came from how Ben Gurion in Israel tried to shut down Yiddish being spoken in Israel and how that disseminated around into the world. But I think that in some cases, I'm a firm believer that the better the art is, the more it will transcend whatever language it's in. I mean, I've enjoyed some operas in Italian and German with no idea what they're singing about, and I love Brazilian music and I have no idea what they're singing about, but it moves me to tears. And so my experience is, you know, when we played in WOMAD to what must have been a 90% non-Jewish audience, there were people in tears listening to that, coming up to me afterwards, still with tears in their eyes, thanking me for it and saying, what did that mean, and all that sort of thing, which we get at a lot of gigs. And that for me is much more the thing. If we just keep focusing on making great art, then the problems, which are the problems that any art person working in the arts faces, which is getting people to come along to concerts, getting people to listen to music, blah, 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 or come and watch theatre. Those are the problems, and Yiddish is just something we need to not take out of the picture in terms of not in any way apologise for it using it as a language, but just to focus on the quality of the outcome, the output.
I guess in a practical way as well, it's exciting to work in Yiddish, and I feel like even talking to some of the other performers that I've collaborated with, and over the last few years they find it exciting too, but it is difficult when it's not your native language, and it takes a lot of time to even get your mouth and tongue around the words. There's an extra level of mental process that you need to be able to understand exactly when it's not your native language, so exactly what word means what, and if you don't understand the grammar, what's sich? How come sich is in there all the time? What does that, which is just like the reflexive part of the verb. So just there's a lot of extra work that you have to do, but I find that gets easier, and it's also exceptionally rewarding at the end when you can perform in a language that not that many people are able to perform in, and that your grandmother performed in 70 years ago.
That's so great, thank you. Can we go to some audience questions? It looks like we have one down here at the front. Do we have microphones? Great. Looks like someone's just running off to get a microphone. I think there'll be one brought down to you, but here it comes. Perfect. Just at the front here.
Thank you. So my question is to Galit. It's maybe more of a comment and a request rather than a question.
You want me to sing a song? I charge double for that.
Kind of. I'm with your husband. I want to see you write something modern, but also traditional. I was privileged to see Ducha Modern in Klas, and I think you're an extraordinary performer. You put on a spectacular performance. I was here with my friend who's here as well. I have to be honest, I didn't understand exactly what you were trying to portray, and I didn't like the technical music. So you're talking about transgenerational Yiddish. I want to see something created that's both traditional and modern at the same time. Do you think that can be incorporated in your new musical love story in Yiddish?
Yes.
Rivka, you said something really interesting about... Right. That's the first time anybody said that in my life. Rivka, you said something really interesting. In the Melbourne Jewish community, the Yiddish speakers are very different. Well, a lot of us, and I'm sure a lot of us in here, we only spoke Yiddish at home with our parents. We didn't speak anything else. We only spoke Yiddish at home. And yet what was interesting is all of our friends spoke Yiddish, but we didn't speak Yiddish to our friends, and then when our parents passed away, we stopped speaking Yiddish. And it was our everyday language. So it was interesting, and now Yiddish is coming back, and we all have to remember how to speak it again. But it was a very interesting phenomena, because if you look at Yiddish, the Jewish community in Sydney, they're from Hungary, and the young people spoke Hungarian amongst themselves, but we didn't speak Yiddish amongst ourselves, and it was from babyhood right up, and even when we were at school, you switched to Yiddish when you got home. So and I don't know if you've seen that phenomena anywhere else, but it's quite fascinating.
So this is a very interesting comment, and this is a feature of Yiddish transmission across the world. An interesting point of history is that there's a group called Jugendruf, Youth for Yiddish, which is based in New York, but it's an international organization. And that organization arose in the 1960s among the baby boomer generation in their late teens, early 20s, who decided that they deliberately wanted to speak Yiddish with each other, which was completely revolutionary. And they all had to learn how. None of them knew how to talk about sports or romance or the foods they liked. They had to undertake this very intensive sort of introspective and communal project of figuring out how to speak Yiddish with peers. And I think it's a process that some of these young people decided to go through. And there was a very active chapter in Sydney as well. I don't know if there was one in Melbourne, but I've read about the Sydney one, where there was a group of young people who they described this as zerbrechen die Zehen. My God, it's hard. I can talk to my mother, my father, my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, everybody about everything, but I can't talk to my friends about the footy. How do I even express those ideas? And so this is a sort of a feature of what does it mean to transmit Yiddish into the future. Among the cohorts of new learners, so younger people who are learning Yiddish in universities, intensive summer programs, and so on, they are immediately learning how to speak with their cohort because they're in a class of young people. And so that the challenges there are that they have difficulty speaking about the non-day-to-day things. Whereas in your case, it sounds like the challenge was how to speak with your peers in Yiddish about day-to-day things. So there are challenges for each kind of Yiddish use in that post-Holocaust period when Yiddish is no longer a full vernacular. People are speaking Yiddish in a particular space with their parents, grandparents, or in a Yiddishist environment, or in a creative space. Or in a Hasidic environment, but there really isn't anyone left in the world who's using Yiddish everywhere, across every space. Shopping, school, religious life, culture, performance. That's a feature of the pre-Holocaust Yiddish world that I don't think we're ever going to recover fully.
I see another hand just midway at the back there.
Thank you. This has been an extraordinary session. And I wanted to first comment on what you brought up, Simon, which was about the idea of focusing on great art. And I think that is what has been the incredibly thrilling thing, is because you've been bringing us great art, both of you. And Rifki's, again, that idea of the intergenerationality. And as an audience member in both Yid gigs and at something like Yentl, there is something I spoke to other audience members about feeling this kind of frisson, but that's the wrong word. There's probably a Yiddish word to talk about it. This embodied kind of reaction to what's going on because Yiddish is in the room. And I wondered, as performers, is that something that you feel and how it works in terms of your family histories? Not a small question, sorry.
I might just quickly add on to that I had, when I was in the, the break in Yentl, in intermission, had people around me and to me saying, this could only happen in Melbourne. Like this performance, this production could only happen here. Nothing like this would happen in New York in this way. So just thinking about that too.
I don't know if this answers the question, but I guess when I'm performing in Yiddish, I do feel a greater sense of connection to my past, which includes a lot of loss, I guess, and perhaps that comes through, and that what makes it like, I don't know, you feel that in the air, because I do feel that when I'm performing, and so I feel like I'm bringing in a way more of my whole self, if I include like my ancestors and stuff, when I am performing in Yiddish. Yeah.
For me, I hope this is not disappointing, but for me, performing any Jewish music is equally exciting, and they just access different parts of my Jewish identity. So I get as excited performing in Hebrew, probably more because I speak it and I understand it. But I mean, I get as excited performing in Hebrew or even playing Jewish music from Morocco that is sometimes sung in Arabic. I feel a deep kinship and sense of belonging with all of those expressions. So for me, it's more, I'm more sort of from the pan-Jewish side of things. But yeah, I mean, Yiddish makes me think of my father's parents, for instance, and I feel strongly identified with them. My grandmother was more Israeli, but my grandfather, and who I didn't know very well, but I feel that part of my Jewish life. And then my life has had a whole lot of different Jewish experiences which have been, all over the world and particularly in Israel.
Another question just down here.
This is a question for the panel, especially for you, Rivka, coming from Canada. So some years ago, a group of us got together to try to describe Australian life in Yiddish. All of us were second generation. So my challenge to the panel is, we were describing a football match. Give me Yiddish for silly midon.
I missed it. I missed the question.
Silly midon,
Oh, silly midon in cricket.
That's right. Give me that in Yiddish.
It's a fielding position in cricket, just sort of to the front and left of the batsman. How would you... I don't know how you would describe that in Yiddish. It'd be like the first base person in baseball or softball.
Interestingly, there is a process for this. If you're interested in creating new vocabulary in Yiddish, there's an organization based in New York called the Yiddish Liga, the League for Yiddish. They put out vocabulary lists about once every week or 10 days around a topic that their members bring to them. So you can write to them and say, I would like vocabulary for the cricket or the footy, and then they will work with you, and it's got the same people who... The translator of Harry Potter into Yiddish is part of that group. There are Hasidim in the group. It's also part of the group that made the Yiddish version of Duolingo. So they involved, if you look up the League for Yiddish and you subscribe, you can actually work with them on creating new vocabulary in all kinds of areas. And it goes out to thousands and thousands of people and often becomes integrated into classroom teaching. So there is a mechanism by which new vocabulary can be created in Yiddish, and if you've created that vocabulary yourself, you can push it to the world through this organization.
That's great.
There you go. That's a great answer. Do we have time for one more question, perhaps? One more. Do we have...
Just a comment.
Oh, just a comment?
When I did Hearn and was learning Hebrew, Yiddish will become like modern Hebrew. I mean, they take traditional Hebrew language and all of a sudden there were no words for chips and pizza and so they just, it's new vocab, and if Yiddish is going to go down the same path, we will create new words for you.
Not for the English speakers, not for the Americans.
Do we have one final question anywhere in the room? Yeah, just here, maybe in the middle.
This might be Rivka. I think you probably could answer this better than me. Yeah.
So the language, I did the translation for Yentl, and I put it into standard Yiddish, Klal Yiddish, which is a not dialect version of the language. And I did that because I actually spoke with the director and with the writers, and the idea was that this isn't a universal language in the play, which is basically set anywhere and nowhere at the same time. So rather than it being situated in a particular shtetl with a particular dialect, we decided to situate it in sort of international standard Yiddish, where it could really be happening anywhere, because the challenges and issues in the play are universal challenges and issues. But that was an artistic decision that was made by the people involved with the play, and it was a conversation that we had, which is, should we do this in Polish dialect? Because we do have a place, we have Bechev, which is an actual place on a map that had a particular Yiddish associated with it. Should we do the Yiddish of that place? And we decided to make it standard Yiddish, which does sound more German. It has, because of the standardization process. And it's always a question. So I know every time that a performer puts on something in Yiddish, and I'm sure Galit and Simon can speak to this too, there's the question, what pronunciation system are we using? Because there are so many dialects, and if you choose standard Yiddish, you irritate everybody, because it doesn't sound like anybody's Yiddish. But if you use Polish dialect, then you're antagonizing the Litvish speakers, so what do you do? And this has been a question for the last 200 years. Whose Yiddish do we use as the language of theater, of music, of journalism? But it's an absolutely legitimate question. And yes, you can learn the dialects. There are all kinds of ways you can listen to audio recordings and things, but it's an ongoing question. Even the response to Duolingo, nobody's ever happy with the dialect that you teach or use in any project ever.
Wonderful. Let's close it up there, I think. I just want to say a herzlichen Dank to, mind my pronunciation, but to the panelists today. Any very brief closing remarks? It's fine. I think perhaps Rivka may have some. No, you don't know? Excellent, perfect. I thought maybe, but very, very big thanks to the panelists and to the audience. Thanks so much.